When Eartha Kitt passed away in 2008, her Connecticut home was left in silence. The house, a secluded property surrounded by tall trees and winding country roads, was the kind of place that had a story written into every corner. Locals remembered it as the retreat where she lived her final years, private, elegant, yet touched with the same dramatic aura she carried throughout her life. For years, the house sat empty, changing hands a few times but never truly lived in. That changed when Mark and Linda Harrington, a couple from New York City, purchased it in late 2022. They had been looking for a weekend home outside the city, something peaceful, historic, but not too far from civilization. The real estate listing for Eartha Kitt's old residence caught their attention immediately. It wasn't cheap, but the house had charm. Wide wooden beams, a stone fireplace, French doors that opened to a terrace overlooking the garden. The locals told them the property had a personality. Some even hinted it had moods, cold spells in summer, creaking noises in rooms no one was in, lights flickering without cause. The Harringtons laughed it off. Old houses always came with quirks, they thought. But from their first night in the home, things felt different. The couple had barely finished unpacking when Linda awoke to the sound of faint music drifting through the hallway. It wasn't a neighbor, the nearest house was a quarter-mile away. The sound was soft, jazzy, almost like a recording from another time. She nudged Mark awake, but by the time he sat up, the music had stopped. He teased her about being spooked by the ghost of Catwoman, but Linda couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the house. As the weeks passed, strange events became more frequent. Mirrors seemed to fog in rooms that weren't humid. The smell of Eartha's signature perfume, gardenia and musk, would fill the hallway for a moment before vanishing. Sometimes, while sitting in the living room, Linda swore she could hear footsteps pacing upstairs, deliberate and slow, as though someone was rehearsing lines or preparing to walk on stage. Mark, skeptical at first, finally had his own encounter. He was working late at the dining table one night when the overhead light began to flicker. He looked up, annoyed, but then froze. In the glass of the patio door, he thought he saw the faint reflection of a woman standing just behind him. She wasn't clear, more of a dark outline, slender, with her head tilted the way Eartha used to pose for photographers. When he spun around, the room was empty, but the smell of perfume lingered in the air. The strangest part was how the energy in the house seemed tied to their emotions. Whenever the couple argued, doors would slam upstairs with no one there. If they laughed together, the faint sound of a woman's laughter, warm, playful, but undeniably not their own, would echo faintly in the background. Linda became convinced that Eartha's presence hadn't left the house. "She's still here," she whispered one night as they sat in the living room with the fire burning low. "Not to hurt us, but watching, listening." But there were moments when the presence felt less affectionate. Some nights, Linda would wake up to find the bedroom door standing wide open, though they had locked it before bed. Other times, she would hear a whisper so close to her ear that she swore someone was leaning right over her pillow. The words were never clear, just a low, musical tone that left her heart racing. The Harringtons began to wonder if they had made a mistake buying the home. Friends who visited often commented on how charged the atmosphere felt, as if the house were alive. A visiting friend who knew Eartha personally claimed she felt her presence immediately upon walking through the door, insisting the house still belonged to her. The couple has not moved out, at least not yet. But the longer they stay, the more they sense that the house refuses to be merely theirs. They often catch themselves speaking about Eartha in the present tense, as if she still resides in the home. And when night falls, the house does not fall silent. Instead, it hums, whispers, and remembers. Some say Eartha Kitt was larger than life, too powerful a spirit to simply vanish. Perhaps that's why, even in death, her voice lingers, haunting the walls of the place she last called home. The Harringtons had lived in the house for barely 2 months when they began to notice that time seemed to move differently inside those walls. Afternoons stretched longer than they should, as if the sun hung above the property a little too long before setting behind the woods. Evenings descended heavily, filling the rooms not just with darkness but with a thickness, a kind of charged air that made both of them pause before turning off the lights. Mark was usually the first to laugh things off. He grew up in a practical household, where creaks in the attic were blamed on with settling, where drafts were explained by bad insulation. But in this house, even his rational explanations rang hollow. He couldn't deny that every time he walked down the central hallway at night, the air would shift colder, sharper, as if he were passing through a space that belonged to someone else. Linda, on the other hand, became more attuned to the subtle changes. She began noticing patterns. The perfume appeared most often near the staircase, drifting down like a memory from the second floor. The faint music seemed to favor the early hours of morning, between 2 and 4, when the house was silent and the world outside was still. And then there were the mirrors, always fogging, always distorting. More than once, she found herself staring into the bathroom mirror only to see her own reflection lag slightly behind her movement, as if it were being pulled by another force. She tried not to tell Mark everything. She knew that if she admitted to hearing whispers again, or seeing shadows glide across the hallway, he would chalk it up to imagination or stress. But keeping it in only seemed to deepen her unease, because she felt as though the house itself knew when she was keeping quiet. The more she stayed silent, the louder the strange disturbances grew, as if demanding to be acknowledged. One night in early spring, the two of them had friends over from the city. They lit the fireplace, opened a few bottles of wine, and tried to give the old house some life. Conversation filled the rooms, but Linda kept noticing her guests glancing over their shoulders, eyes flicking toward the darkened corners of the living room. At one point, their friend Julia leaned close and whispered, "You do know this house feels different, right?" When Linda pressed her, Julia shook her head quickly, forcing a smile. "Nothing, just it feels like we're being listened to." Later that evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Linda wandered downstairs for a glass of water. The house was utterly still. She padded into the kitchen, barefoot, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. As she reached for a glass, she heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps above her. Slow, measured, almost theatrical. She froze, her hand hovering in the air. The rhythm of the steps seemed deliberate, like someone pacing, pausing, then pacing again. She turned toward the ceiling, heart thudding, and whispered, "Mark!" But she knew it wasn't him. He was asleep upstairs in their room, on the opposite side of the house. She climbed the staircase, each creak beneath her weight echoing in the silence. At the top, the hallway stretched before her, bathed in a pale wash of moonlight through the windows. The air smelled faintly sweet, floral, the perfume stronger than ever. And then she saw it. A shadow, tall and slender, drifting across the far end of the hall, disappearing into what had been Eartha's old dressing room. Her breath caught in her throat. She stood there for a long moment, staring into the darkness, waiting for movement, for sound, for something. Nothing came. But when she turned back toward their bedroom, she realized the door she had closed was now wide open. The next morning, she told Mark everything. For once, he didn't argue. He admitted that in the middle of the night, he had woken briefly to the sound of humming soft, low, like a woman rehearsing a song under her breath. It had been so faint that he almost convinced himself it was the wind. But now, hearing Linda's story, he looked pale. From that night on, the Harringtons began to notice that the house no longer simply acted up at random. The disturbances seemed purposeful, almost responsive. When Mark raised his voice during a phone call, a door would slam upstairs. When Linda spent long afternoons alone in the house, she would feel as though someone were walking just behind her, their presence light but insistent. They started leaving lights on in the hallways at night, though it made no difference. The shadows always seemed to fall thicker than they should, pooling in corners, clinging to the walls. At times, they would both catch the faintest whisper of laughter, playful and musical, drifting through the house without a source. The longer they stayed, the clearer it became. The house was not empty. It had never been empty. And as spring edged into summer, the sense of being observed no longer felt passive. It was as though the house, or perhaps the spirit within it, was beginning to take more interest in them, watching their routines, learning their rhythms, and making its presence known in ways neither of them could ignore. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The days slipped into one another, and the Harringtons began to feel as though the rhythm of the house was slowly becoming the rhythm of their lives. They had moved there for peace, for space away from the constant thrum of the city, but instead they found themselves pulled deeper into the strange pulse of the property, as though the walls themselves set the tempo of their days. The mornings always began the same way, with a heaviness in the air, as if the house had not yet released whatever had lingered there during the night. Even the light that filtered through the curtains felt muted, softened, like sunlight seen through smoke. Linda often woke before Mark and would lie still for long minutes, listening to the house breathe around her, the faint creak of a beam shifting, the groan of the old staircase, the almost imperceptible sound of fabric rustling somewhere just out of sight, like a dress brushing against a doorway. She had begun to walk the house each morning before breakfast, a quiet circuit through the rooms as though she were checking on something she couldn't name. She told herself it was habit, or perhaps a way of settling into the house, but deep down she knew she was searching. The mirrors were always first. She would glance into them quickly, never letting herself linger, because the longer she looked, the more uneasy she felt. It wasn't that she saw anything unusual, not exactly. It was the sense that the reflection wasn't wholly hers, that some detail was slightly delayed, slightly wrong. One morning she swore she saw another figure just behind her, faint, transparent, with dark hair pulled back tightly from the face. She blinked and it was gone, but the smell of perfume hung thick in the air for the rest of the day, following her even as she moved to the garden to escape it. Mark tried to keep things normal, but he too was changing. At first he spent long hours on his laptop in the dining room, confident that the strange atmosphere was just a trick of their imaginations, a product of their nerves in a new place. But he soon found it impossible to concentrate. The dining room window faced the garden, and more than once, while he sat there typing, he felt the undeniable sensation that someone was standing just outside the glass, watching him. He would lift his head suddenly, but there was never anyone there, only the swaying of the tall trees and the shifting patterns of shadow across the lawn. Still, his chest tightened every time, because the feeling did not leave when he looked away. It clung to him, the certainty that his movements were being studied, that every word he typed was being read by unseen eyes. The house seemed to thrive on silence. When it was full of sound, friends talking, music playing, laughter, the energy seemed lighter, almost welcoming. But once the house fell quiet, the air thickened again, pressing down on them, urging them to lower their voices, to walk more carefully, to respect something ancient that lingered in the walls. At night, when the last lamp was turned off, the silence was never complete. There was always something under it. A low hum, the scrape of something against wood, the faint rise and fall of a melody hummed in a voice that was unmistakably feminine. One evening, Linda stood in the kitchen preparing dinner while Mark was upstairs. The room was dim, the only light coming from the small lamp above the counter. She was chopping vegetables when she suddenly felt the temperature drop, so quickly that her hands trembled. The air filled instantly with perfume, rich, heady, gardenia with something sharper beneath it. Her eyes lifted to the window over the sink, and in the glass she saw the faint outline of a woman behind her, so close it made her shoulders tense. She dropped the knife and spun around, but the kitchen was empty. She backed against the counter, heart hammering, whispering to herself that it was nothing, that she had imagined it, but she knew she had not. When Mark came down minutes later, he found the kitchen in disarray, vegetables scattered, the knife lying on the floor. She could not explain what had happened, but he saw the fear in her eyes and said nothing. The more the house revealed itself, the more Linda felt it was choosing her. The whispers seemed to follow her more than Mark. The perfume lingered longer in the rooms she occupied, and the faint laughter always seemed to come when she was alone. She began to wonder if Eartha's presence was less about haunting the house in general and more about watching her specifically, measuring her, perhaps even testing her. At night, when she lay awake beside her sleeping husband, she would sometimes feel the mattress dip slightly, as though someone had sat on the edge of the bed. She would not move, would not breathe, staring into the dark while her skin prickled with the undeniable sensation of being studied. Mark noticed her growing exhaustion, the way her eyes darted to corners, the way she lingered before mirrors as though expecting something to emerge. He tried to reassure her, but the house made liars of both of them. One night he woke to the sound of her whispering urgently in the dark. He reached for her and found her sitting upright, staring at the bedroom door, her lips moving as though she were answering someone who had spoken from the other side. When he shook her gently, she blinked, dazed, and claimed she had been dreaming. But he could still hear the echo of another voice, low and rich, fading from the room as if retreating down the hallway. Neither of them spoke of moving. It was as though the house itself had settled around them, and leaving did not feel like an option, though neither could explain why. The idea of putting the house back on the market never surfaced between them. Not once. Instead, they continued their routines, adjusting to the strange rhythms, almost as if they were becoming part of the performance. Actors on a stage whose director was unseen but undeniably present. And as the summer deepened, the house grew louder, more insistent, its presence no longer confined to whispers and perfume. The nights brought new sounds, the unmistakable rustle of fabric moving down the hall, the tap of footsteps on the staircase, the faint hum of a tune that seemed to circle them wherever they went. The house was no longer content with shadows and hints. It was preparing, it seemed, for something more. By the end of that summer, the Harringtons were no longer the same couple who had arrived full of excitement and hope for a quiet country life. The house had changed them, drawn them into its rhythm, made them part of its atmosphere. Their friends from the city noticed it instantly, how pale they looked, how cautious their movements seemed, how their laughter was shorter, more nervous, as though always aware of being overheard. Invitations to visit dwindled, partly because the Harringtons stopped extending them, and partly because their few remaining friends admitted they simply did not like being in the house. Inside, the hauntings escalated. Doors no longer just creaked. They opened wide on their own. Lights flickered until they dimmed completely, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight through tall windows. Objects shifted subtly, never dramatically enough to scream poltergeist, but in ways that left no doubt. Keys placed on the counter found in the upstairs hallway. Books moved from one shelf to another. Chairs turned slightly toward the center of the room as though waiting for someone to sit. But it was the music that became the most unbearable. At first, it had been faint, a whisper of jazz, a suggestion of a song barely caught in the night air. Now it grew louder, clearer. Sometimes it came from the old phonograph in the study, though they had never once used it. Other times, it came from nowhere at all, as if the very walls of the house had learned to sing. It was Eartha's voice, sultry, commanding, alive. Her songs seemed to weave through the house, not in full performance but in fragments. A verse here, a chorus there, sometimes only humming. It followed them room to room, soft at first, then swelling as though demanding recognition. Linda grew withdrawn. She spent long hours in the dressing room, the same one where the shadow had first vanished months ago. She said little, but Mark would sometimes hear her speaking in a low voice, murmuring words he couldn't quite catch. Once, as he stood outside the door listening, he thought he heard another voice answer her, smooth, rich, unmistakably female. When he pushed the door open, she was sitting before the vanity, staring into the mirror, her lips parted as though mid-conversation, though the room fell silent the instant he entered. Her eyes met his in the glass, and for a moment he thought it wasn't his wife looking back, but someone older, sharper, amused. Mark began sleeping less. Nights were a constant cycle of disturbances, the perfume filling the bedroom until it was suffocating, the mattress dipping under unseen weight, the laughter echoing faintly down the hallway. One night, unable to bear it, he stormed into the hallway, shouting into the empty dark, demanding that it stop. The house responded with silence, thick and heavy, until a door at the far end slammed shut with such force that the windows rattled. Linda appeared at the doorway, pale and calm, and whispered, "Don't anger her." It was then Mark realized his wife had crossed a threshold he had not. She no longer spoke of leaving. She no longer spoke of being frightened. Instead, she spoke of Eartha as if she were still alive, as if she were still the mistress of the house. "She's not gone," Linda said one evening, her eyes shining with something he couldn't place. "She just doesn't want to be forgotten. This was her stage, her sanctuary. She won't leave it, not for anyone." By autumn, the Harringtons stopped talking about selling, not because they didn't want to, but because it seemed impossible. Every time Mark entertained the thought, the house would answer. Papers would go missing, phone calls to realtors would cut off in static, arguments about moving would be silenced by sudden noises, the slam of a door, the shatter of a glass falling on its own. It was as though the house itself would not allow the subject to exist. One night in October, the worst came. Mark woke to find the bed empty, the sheets beside him cool. He rushed through the house, calling Linda's name, his voice echoing back at him through the hollow rooms. He found her at last in the dressing room, sitting before the mirror in the dark, her reflection illuminated by the faint glow of moonlight. She was humming softly, a tune that was not her own but Eartha's, and the mirror before her did not reflect only her. For a heartbeat, Mark swore he saw another figure behind her, tall and elegant, her hands resting lightly on Linda's shoulders. He shouted, ran to her, pulled her away from the vanity. But the perfume was overwhelming, choking, pressing into every corner of the room. The glass of the mirror rippled faintly, as if it were water disturbed by a stone. For a moment, he thought he heard Eartha's voice, clear, rich, almost laughing. "This is my house." From that night forward, nothing was the same. Linda no longer resisted. She moved through the house with a serenity that unsettled him, as though she belonged more to the house than to him. She began wearing Eartha's old perfume, though Mark had never seen her buy any. She lingered at the piano in the living room, running her fingers across the keys, humming melodies she had never known before. And when he tried to speak to her about it, when he begged her to see what was happening, she only smiled faintly and said, "We are only guests here. She decides how long we stay." Mark stayed too, though he never understood why. Perhaps it was the pull of the house. Perhaps the hold it had already woven into their lives. They no longer spoke of leaving. They no longer questioned the footsteps, the laughter, the music. It became their life, a constant duet with the unseen. The house stands still, quiet from the outside, a beautiful old property tucked into the trees of Connecticut. To passers-by it looks serene, dignified, full of history. But those who step inside know otherwise. The air carries her voice still, soft and insistent, reminding anyone who listens that Eartha Kitt has never truly left. And the Harringtons remain, half owners, half prisoners, sharing their lives with a presence that refuses to let go, living each day in the shadow of a woman whose spirit was too fierce, too commanding, to ever surrender her stage even in death. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.